And boys and girls, welcome to VUX World. Really need to bring back the VUX World theme tune. I think that's what's missing in this situation here. VUX World theme tune, little staging video beforehand. You'd have thought I'd have got off my ass and sorted this out after 5.5 years of doing this, but there you go. What's most important is the content. That's what I would say. Anyway, welcome to VUX World. Thank you for joining us. Today we have an epic conversation with Matt Taylor from Knowbl. You probably heard Matt on the podcast before. If you were at the Voice and AI Summit in September, then you would have seen Matt speak on our stage. And Knowbl are doing some very interesting stuff using some incredible technologies, very bullish on large language models. However, unlike many other vendors who are bullish on large language models and generative AI for the sake of being fashionable and trendy, what Matt and the team are doing is really working out how to apply this stuff properly in the enterprise with the right kind of controls and working on it in the right kind of way. So he's got some developments to share with us, which we're going to do. There's been hell on at OpenAI. And so we will have a bit of a discussion about what's going on there and what that means for the industry, what the current situation means for you and me if you're a brand in this space and you kind of exploring generative AI, if you're a vendor in this space and you've built a whole bunch of capabilities using OpenAI's APIs and now the future of OpenAI is looking a little bit kind of hasty, like what do you do? So we're going to have a bit of a conversation about that. But before we dive into that, I do need to tell you about a couple of things. Next week, if you are in the listening to this on November 21st, 22nd, or 23rd, it'll be next week. If you listen to it after then, it'll be this week, which is the Call and Contact Center Expo. It is happening at the XL Arena in London on the 29th and 30th of November, next week, as I said. A whole bunch of companies are going to be there. A whole bunch of people are going to be there. Essentially, if you haven't been to the XL Arena in London before, it's a massive space. And if you are even remotely interested in customer experience, if it is your job to be improving customer experience and contact center systems or anything like that, customer service, you really need to be there. All of the top vendors are going to be there, showcasing their most current initiatives. And I'm sure that the whole place is going to be flooded with generative AI talk. I'll be doing a talk myself on the Thursday the 30th, and I'm going to be talking about whether or not AI is an opportunity or a threat for the contact center. For those of you that follow me and have been listening to this show for quite a while, you will probably know the position that I stand. However, it will be a balanced argument. Aside from that, if you do want to go there, by the way, you can go to callandcontactcenterexpo.co.uk. It's a bit of a mouthful, but just Google it. callandcontactcenterexpo.co.uk. Other things coming up. Next year, there is the AI World Series. All right, you can go to aiworldseries.com to find out more. Essentially, what this is a awards ceremony, awards recognition for anybody working in the AI sort of space. If you are a brand that's implementing AI, if you're a vendor that's building tools, if you're a individual who's been working on some interesting stuff, then you can essentially apply to kind of be considered for these awards. The categories include the best of use of AI in insurance and a whole bunch of other verticals, healthcare, travel, hospitality, etc. And then also there's a load of stuff around products. So the best use of AI for analytics, best use of AI for sentiment analysis, best use of generative AI for text in a product, for image, for video, etc., etc., etc. This event is tuned into by hundreds and thousands even of people all across the world. It's set in Dubai if you want to go there yourself, or you can tune in online, and regardless you will still benefit from all of the exposure of being crowned a champion in whichever category you decide to submit for. I've got Harry Potter in my head. I've been watching Harry Potter lately. I was going to say you're going to be crowned a Tri-Wizard champion, but maybe not Tri-Wizard, but it'll be definitely an AI champion if you do enter. You can go to aiworldseries.com to enter. aiworldseries.com to enter. All right. So there you go. Anyway, on with the show. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Matt Taylor, Chief Product Officer at Knowbl. Matt, hello again, my friend.
Hey, how's it going, Kane?
Very good. Very good. How are you?
Good. Things are going really well. And, the holiday season's upon us. So it's always, it's a time where enterprise tend to slow down. But I think this year might be a little bit different with just, the heat of generative AI and, we're actually seeing a lot of enterprises still, being very responsive around this time, which, not used to.
Yeah, it's mad, isn't it? The whole pace of everything keeps kind of increasing. And typically, people would think that December November, like Thanksgiving this week and stuff like that, things would slow down. But it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't really feel like that. It feels as though sort of certainly for the retail and stuff like that, it's ramping up for Christmas, so things are going to get busier rather than quieter. And yeah, the pace of change just seems to be so fast that no one can really switch off these days. It's mad.
Yeah, no doubt. And we've talked about this before, but that's why I think whoever continues to focus on innovation in this space, whether it's the big players or vendors like Knowbl, that's the only way you're going to be able to keep up. It's moving at a pace now that none of us thought would be the case at this point in time. And so I think just if you ever feel like you're not putting cycles into innovation, that's probably going to be a big problem in just 6 months to a year. It used to be you would see that sometimes biting you down the road later, like 3 to 5 years. But I think now it's more important than ever.
Definitely, and more important than ever to kind of stay agile and responsive to what's going on, and I think that the businesses that can be quick, respond fast, and make changes, pivot where necessary, are the ones that end up kind of fighting fit. And I think this week has definitely it's at least made a lot of people, I would think, pause to not even just consider their options in light of the stuff that's been going on with OpenAI, but just generally pause and watch and wonder what's going on. And if I've got a product that's using OpenAI's APIs, what does that mean for me? And it's kind of a mad sort of time at the minute. I mean, I'm sure you've been following what's been going on with OpenAI over the last few days. You can't open LinkedIn without coming into contact with some new development that wasn't a development 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I found out Friday afternoon. I was on a flight and got a text from someone, letting me know that Sam Altman had been ousted by the board. And then it was just a domino effect of a lot of different events. And still not exactly sure all the details and if that'll be even released. But it's very interesting to say the least. OpenAI is taken over as a leader in this space. Funded very heavily by Microsoft, $10 billion, and seeing that they're facing some of these problems, there's a lot of ways you can take it, right? If you're an enterprise or any user of OpenAI's technology APIs, there is a little bit of a concern there of what is the longevity of this company. The face of it is not only gone, but a lot of their most tenured researchers. I just find it interesting, especially that Microsoft is snagging all of them, right? It's almost like they're hedging their bet that hey, we put $10 billion in this company, we're not letting anyone walk away without taking a swing. So in general, I do think there's obviously cause for concern. As a vendor in this space, I'm more or less just watching to see what happens. I don't think it necessarily affects our strategy at this point. Like I've said, but numerous times, we're not a model company. We leverage these models, whether they're commercial or open source, and so I don't necessarily have a stake in this in terms of whether they succeed or not. But it is interesting nonetheless, especially like you said, you can't go on LinkedIn without seeing quite a bit of activity about what's the newest, whether it's the employees writing a letter to the board or, all the new people that are moving over to Microsoft's subsidiary. So, it's interesting.
It's mad. It's mad. For those people who haven't been, glued to their screens over the last few days, essentially, a very brief sort of synopsis is OpenAI, as you know, fired Sam Altman on Friday night. Greg Brockman, who basically is a senior VP there, he kind of immediately sent a message to the rest of the staff and said, don't really know what's going on. Sam's gone and I quit, basically. And then there was a scramble at OpenAI to see what's going to happen and stuff like that. Sunday, I think it was, Microsoft said that, or it might even be early Monday, Microsoft hired Sam Altman, hired Greg Brockman. And so now it's like, the two people who were the head of the company, the two public figures at the company that were doing all of the, the keynotes and all of the sort of like publicity and stuff like that, they're now at Microsoft. And then it comes out that the information published something today, it might have been yesterday, that during the course of the weekend, the board at OpenAI tried to kind of pursue the Anthropic CEO, Darius, I forget his surname, to come and join OpenAI as CEO and then merge Anthropic with OpenAI. And then, as you said, the 710 out of 770 members of staff at OpenAI wrote a letter to the board, or signed a letter to the board, saying, if you don't resign, we're going to leave and join Microsoft. Now, whether Microsoft will take them, who knows? It's quite a bold claim to say we're just going to go and leave. We're going to go and join Microsoft. But that's kind of where it is at the moment. The staff have basically revolted and been like, leave. The board needs to leave, otherwise we're leaving. The board seemingly have made a couple of bad decisions in the process of trying to sort this kind of stuff out. The reason stated apparently is that Sam Altman wasn't entirely truthful with the board about certain activities. There was a rumor at the back end of last week that he's been having conversations with Microsoft about joining. There was other rumors that he'd been having conversations with a Saudi investment group about a chip startup that apparently he'd been theorizing to some degree. Whether that is the reason why, who knows? The other rumors is that Sam Altman was driven more by commercial interests than safety, and so the kind of non-profit side of OpenAI and the members of the board who are more concerned with safety and the non-profit organization not particularly liking the fact that, apparently, this is all rumour, not particularly liking the fact that Sam Altman was pursuing things like the GPT store and having revenue share and gunning for revenue kind of prematurely and stuff like that. And so, yeah, that's where it is. So what will happen then is obviously unknown. Either the board stands strong, the staff stand their ground and they leave, hoping to get swept up by Microsoft, in which case, what's the point of OpenAI? Maybe the board resign and a new board comes in. God knows what that will look like and what shape that will take and how long that will take and who's going to appoint the board if the board disappears. And then, or things just calm down and resolve themselves and everything's kind of fine. But it's a mad situation. Microsoft potentially, they own 50% of OpenAI. They've invested, as you said, billions of dollars into OpenAI. They could feasibly try and acquire a broader share to then basically take ownership of it and reinstate Sam Altman and Greg in position. Or they could swoop up some more staff. They've already taken on a bunch of researchers, as you said, swoop up some more staff and start again, try and build something themselves. Someone commented on my LinkedIn about the fact that, not the fact, but in theory, to build these models, you need data, immense amounts of processing capabilities and talent. Microsoft allegedly have been providing OpenAI with a shit ton of data. They're definitely providing them with all of their compute because that's what the investment basically is. It's credits for Azure cloud services. And now they've got some of the talent. And so, join the dots. They could acquire OpenAI. They could just build their own stuff. Who knows? It's all a mad situation.
Yeah, it's, and like you said, there's a few of those rumors and, whether they're true or not, we'll have to wait to find out. But it is interesting hearing that the board is the one potentially pushing them away from, more of the commercial opportunities or is more concerned of the safety. Most of the time, what I've seen is that the board is the one pushing towards revenue and not as much concerned of the ethics and safety, where you have the idealistic CEO that's all about, making the world a better place. And so it's interesting to see those roles a little bit switched here. But nonetheless, I do think Microsoft is not going to let their investment become too big of a risk. And that's why you see them extremely involved in this. I don't think they're going to, for example, let any of the top tier talent walk to Google or Amazon, Meta without a pretty big fight.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even though OpenAI, I don't suppose you would class it as a startup anymore. It's, worth multi-billions of dollars. But it's not necessarily too big to fail. Like, remember in the financial crisis and they were talking about the banks being too big to fail. They've got far too much money, far too much kind of like fingers in too many pies or whatever. The government can't let the banks fail. The economy can't fail. So the banks basically end up being too big to fail. I don't think that OpenAI is in that situation where it's too big to fail. 770 staff is not a massive organization. The valuation is based on potential future, realities that have the potential to occur. However, it's definitely too close to Microsoft to fail. As you said, Microsoft have invested billions in this company. They see it seemingly as a way of them definitely massively boosting their cloud business, because everything's running on Azure, and everything, the better OpenAI does, the better that is for Microsoft. But also it gets them in serious conversations about being an innovative brand, being at the forefront of technology. Google, fair enough, is building its own stuff. Amazon's building some of its own stuff. It's a bit quieter than Google is. But Microsoft is sort of doesn't really have the same degree, although it's published some open source models and stuff like that, but it doesn't have the same weight at the moment as the Google, the Metas, for example, Amazon's. So this is a kind of key strategic thing for Microsoft, is to be associated with groundbreaking, innovative technology. And OpenAI has been the leader in that space ahead of Google for the last few years, so it's definitely too close to Microsoft to fail. I think that worst comes to worst, Microsoft, I think, will probably just absorb it.
Yeah. Sorry about that. The Google Home must have heard you say. But I again, it's one of those things from my perspective as a startup in this space. It's just going to be watching. I don't want to say from the sideline because we're in the same space, but again, there's differences in terms of model companies like OpenAI and what they're trying to accomplish, and more of the applications of these models and how we can leverage these at the enterprise level. So it's always interesting when you have this much turmoil at that big of a company. I always, as a founder, there's always things that are aren't going perfect at your company, right? Like whether you're a startup or even, all the way up to a very large organization, there's issues, right? Like that's just happened, whether they're people, process, or, even the economy, whatever there is, there's always something. And it just reminded me that even when, you look at something like OpenAI, that, they have the world is their oyster, right? They have $10 billion in investment, some of the best researchers in the world, everything going extremely well. And you see all this and you're like, yeah, like, grass is always greener on the other side. It always looks like someone else is, has got their stuff together, when in reality, all these startups, all these companies have things that they're dealing with. So it was obviously not to that extent, but it was very interesting just because they've been kind of the brainchild, or transformed this whole large language model movement and put such a spotlight on this industry. And if they're them being that company, it's weird to see that company now kind of falling apart. And it's not to say that that's what is going to end up happening. We'll again wait to see, but it is interesting.
What do you kind of think of, and what's your thoughts from a product standpoint? A lot of companies have been really putting all their eggs in the OpenAI basket really over certainly the last year. There's lots of other large language model providers out there. There's a load of open source large language models, and a lot of vendors are using those as well. But there is a lot of, I would say, I don't have any data on this, but I would imagine if you took 100 companies that are using large language models in some degree, I would wager that probably more than 50% of them are using OpenAI as a core part of it, maybe more. So does this make you reconsider anything from a product standpoint when you can see a company that seems to be really stable then going through this rockiness and the future being slightly uncertain? Like, how does that change the way you think about the product that utilizes APIs from that company?
Yeah, I think, definitely from a go-to-market perspective, I see, one from a messaging perspective on just a chance to reemphasize how, how we are positioned in the market versus the Anthropics, the Hugging Faces, the OpenAIs, and how we leverage those models to power our system, but that almost diversifies us in terms of like, there's a lot of vendors out there that are, pretty much attached to OpenAI. So where OpenAI goes is going to be an indicator of where their business goes. And so that would be one thing I would just want to, it's a chance to re-clarify or, emphasize where we stand in the market. And then again, there are a ton of enterprises that are leveraging them. A few of the enterprises that we've had conversations with in the past that had interest in leveraging Knowbl are have gone down the OpenAI route. So I definitely think we'll find a way to reconnect with them and see if that has changed their mind. I would imagine that most of these enterprises will shift over to Microsoft. That's kind of going to be a transition that Microsoft and OpenAI might work together on. But it goes back to a lot of what I said before, where OpenAI is providing an API, but it's how you leverage that API, the AI pipelining, and the actual application and infrastructure that you put around that. And it's a lot easier said than done. And we've seen this before in the build versus buy, or build versus buy versus partner. I think the partner that we talked about this on our the Conversational AI Divide podcast, but you really broke it down very well in terms of when you think about building versus buying versus partnering with the vendor and what that actually means. I think that having the right talent, especially in today's ecosystem, is a lot harder than it was before, because these jobs, these roles of AI engineers, data scientists, researchers, they're more coveted than ever have. So you have to be paying top dollar if you want to have those types of people in your organization. And without them, I think it is a little bit of a fool's errand to try and, you leverage all these APIs, build out all of that structure and, at the application level. But again, that's just my perspective. And from what I've seen, I can imagine that, and this happened before when, even if I go back to the previous startup I was at, there was a lot of companies that said, hey, you know what, there's a lot of open source models. We can start stitching these together and build our own. And in a year down the line, they realized it was a lot more expensive than we thought it would be, a lot more time consuming. And then, opening up the idea of working with the vendor. So I think we'll see some of those enterprises, and some of them might be successful, right? Like, some of them might still figure out a way to leverage those APIs, even if they switch from OpenAI. There's plenty of models out there that can be leveraged. It's just the talent is not that easy to find these days.
Definitely. I mean, I think your approach is sensible anyway, which is to leverage whichever models are best for the job at hand, rather than putting all of your eggs in one particular basket. There is another risk that comes with putting your eggs in one basket anyway, and this is nothing to do with the OpenAI situation specifically. It's to do with really the development of the models. There's a guy, forget his name now, apologies for doing that again, but he's going to be on the podcast soon. He did a study looking at the performance of GPT-4, and then when they released an update to that model, he's kind of spot checked it and things have changed. And so, even if you over rely on one particular model, the changes and iterations to those models are going to change things. And if you look at OpenAI and the APIs they've provided, over time, they deprecate the older ones. So even if you find that you don't want to upgrade, you don't want to move to the most up-to-date model, it's likely only a matter of time before the one you're using gets turned off. So how do you also plan for that in a solution like Knowbl, where it's not as if you're building a chatbot, you're building a platform that others are using to build things. So it's almost like, how do you keep on top of the changes within these models from a kind of product standpoint,
Yeah, that's a great question. That's part of what I alluded to earlier in I think one of our previous sessions, of how innovation is consistently going to be the way you differentiate. And part of that innovation is understanding the models and the growth of these models, and which models make most sense for which use cases. And that's something that we have as part of our platform team, is we do have AI engineers that are consistently testing these newer models, because there's a lot of sacrifices that you make when you go to the larger models, whether it's, hey, we need the amount of infrastructure that's needed to decrease the latency is higher dollars per query now. And so it's figuring out the right balance of where we don't need those super large models and can get away with some of those models that are a little bit smaller, but might actually even be more specific to that use case. And again, the difference that I'm seeing in how a lot of the industry talks about it versus how we talk about it, and we can get a lot really into this, is this idea that a lot of the applications and use cases that I'm seeing are really going towards internal, employee facing, agent facing. And I'm not saying those use cases don't drive value, because they absolutely do, right? If an agent has the right tooling to be able to deliver answers to their customers quicker and easier, that's always going to be a value add. But when we think about the chatbot journey from the very initial chatbots, the dream was that we could have these chatbots, virtual assistants, IVR, automate these to remove some of them from our agents' hands, right? And some of them, you're always going to need a human, especially with some of those more unique circumstances. But those ones that we want to automate, that direct customer support, that's what the dream state was. And I'm seeing that the talks of generative AI are really focused on agent facing, employee facing, and at Knowbl, we have a couple pilots like that as well. But we also are doing direct customer support use cases with our clients, and the reasoning for that is that we have a safe approach. We have a way where you can have guarantees of the outputs, and that ultimately, to me, is where I don't see a ton of the Gardeners of the world focusing on. I think a lot of the money and the spend is on that internal facing, and that's pretty normal, just because I think there's a level of understanding and education that's going to happen over time. But I think right now that's one of the biggest differences in how we're leveraging these large language models.
Yeah, I've noticed the same around internal use cases and stuff like that. And from those that I've spoke to who are predominantly using this technology internally for contact center, agent assist type things, or HR, or there's even ones where I know of a bank in America which is using it for an internal sort of like document advice search kind of thing. And I can understand why you would do that, because of the risk of hallucination, as you said, basically. And so it's perceived as it's a stepping stone, it's a step on a stepping stone towards that customer-facing automation, but it's one that can be done with less risk, because if there is hallucinations, it doesn't really matter as much if it's staff, because they might not spot that it's a hallucination, but at least there's less danger because there's definitely a human in the loop there and all that kind of stuff. And so I can understand why people would be kind of tempted to do that first. So what is the alternative if someone is thinking about doing an internal use case because they perceive that these large language models and generative models are too risky to put in front of customers? What's the remediation to encourage them to do that? Like, what specifically is it that enables you to put it in front of customers without that risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we're leveraging these large language models, if I go back to the early days of Knowbl, so back 2021, we're actually a little over our 2-year anniversary. And I remember
Congrats.
thank you, appreciate it. And I remember our first month, we explored the idea of leveraging retrieval augmented generation, RAG, and it's very popularized now. And we talked about leveraging that to the enterprise, and we found out right away that, in early conversations, if we couldn't guarantee, the output, and the litmus test of that is really, can you tell me all the answers that it can possibly say? If you can't, then there aren't guarantees on that, right? You can have guardrails all you want, But if you don't have a list of outputs that you can send their compliance, a lot of enterprises are never going to be okay going to direct customer support with that. So then what we looked at is like, okay, how do we could leverage these large language models to create semantic embeddings. And you see a lot of vendors are starting to hop on this bandwagon, if you will, in terms of being able to semantically search through content. And so this is what we very much started with. And what that really is you leverage these large language models to create these embeddings, these vector representations throughout the content, and leverage the user's query to then match that to the most relevant content. So if I come into a brand and I ask a question, it's going to bring me to, ideally whatever content is most relevant to my question. And we started with that. And then what we started to see was, okay, well, that's like a search experience, but there's conversational elements that are missing of that. And what I mean by that is there's, contextual follow-ups that happen. There's workflows that happen. When I go in, a lot of these enterprises aren't just trying to answer an informational question of like, hey, how do I do this? They're actually want to help that person do that certain task. And so these workflows, these conversational, contextual follow-ups, those are what are traditionally built through these conversational building blocks that we've known as intents and entities and, transitions, and all of that, is what we think of when we think of the previous generation of conversational AI. And so what we've looked at is, okay, where can we leverage large language models to apply to each of those building blocks so that we're still constraining the model's output. So you'll never be able to go in and not exactly know, what are all the options the user can get, and that response can be. But instead, now it's like, okay, we're going to leverage these traditional blocks, but completely rethink how we do that, leveraging large language models. So we found, and these are some of the patents, we found ways to automate contextual awareness so that every time there's a follow-up, the AI is already understanding of the previous queries. So it doesn't need to be trained on, the next type of query that can result into a follow-up utterance. And so leveraging that large language models to be able to power that. We've talked numerous times about the entity extraction, how difficult that traditionally is, and finding ways to leverage large language models to do that entity extraction. But then there's, and we've talked about those two, but even further, what we found is there's so many different tools that we can leverage large language models to expedite the build. And one of those things is these workflows take a long time to build out. And what we have found is we can leverage large language models to do what we're calling transcript inference. And really what that is we can take these transcripts. Obviously, the way we work with brands is we would want to leverage transcripts that they would say, hey, this is an ideal conversation. The agent handled this extremely successfully. And what we can do is allow this large language model to actually build out the entire conversational flow for us. And now we have this constrained output that we can manipulate and, obviously change different parts of how it responded and add intents or flows that we want. But it gets us 80% of the way there way quicker than we ever could. And there's plenty of ways that we can do that. We're right now in a few of our pilots, we're leveraging these large language models to transform the content, because what we noticed right away when we were getting into these pilots was, hey, we're going to, the whole idea is we're going to take their content and use that to power the system. Well, unfortunately, a lot of times brands have content that's not necessarily formatted in the best way. It's not conversational at its face value. And so what we can do is leverage these large language models to transform that content, generate, specific ways of how they would want to answer questions, rephrasing, summarization, all that kind of stuff. And then the last very novel piece is, and this is something that we've run into recently when we take a lot of content in very nuanced or jargon specific industries, is that, sometimes the AI, when you're leveraging those semantic embeddings, it can get tripped up by these proper nouns that it's never, probably hasn't been trained on. And what we found is there's ways to leverage large language models to decompose the query. And what that means is we're essentially asking the large language model, like, hey, can you first, before we even put it through the semantic retrieval method, can you make sense of this? What does this mean? And coming up with different phrases that leveraging the large language model comes up with different ways that question could be asked, to then decompose that query and find out what are some of, like, is that specific proper noun even meant to be handled, or is that more just extra noise that we can eliminate when we're going to retrieve that content? So I know there's like quite a bit that I covered there. Some of it, definitely can get a little bit more technical. But right now, that's just the high level picture, is to think of, we are looking at conversational AI, the traditional building blocks, and figuring out how we could leverage large language models to augment those building blocks to make it faster and easier than ever before, but still have that controlled output that you're going to need.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the first part of that you mentioned is the contextual awareness, and I've seen some examples of people doing this, or trying to do this contextual awareness by, it's a very clunky way of doing it, and you won't be able to kind of do this in any form of scale. Nearly, yeah. My son comes in dressed as Harry Potter, asking if I'm finished. Bless him. So you won't be able to do this at any type of scale, but the methodology is that an utterance comes from the customer, the user. You then take that utterance, you build it into a prompt and send that to a large language model, and you provide it with, this is all the stuff that we're going to talk about. This is an example of the utterance. You might have some data behind the scenes that it can use to draw responses from, etc. But then essentially, whenever it generates a response, whatever the user says next, you basically take the transcript from before it and feed that into the model as context. Now, that really isn't necessarily dialogue management, because you don't have any state management at all. You're basically just taking a transcript, throwing it to a model, hoping that it can understand the gist of it, hoping that the conversation doesn't go on for long enough that the whole kind of, you run out of tokens, basically. And it just doesn't seem to be a sensible way. It seems to be so flaky that I wouldn't even consider attempting it. So what is different around the kind of contextual awareness side of things? Is it a combination of a little bit more of a deterministic workflow type situation, or is it a better way of kind of keeping on feeding the model with prior bits of information, for want of a better word?
No, that's a great question, and the method that you're referring to again is what we're not really that bullish on, and what I mean by that is leveraging the large language model as like the actual application straight up, meaning we're gonna keep giving this prompts and keep letting this dictate how the conversation is handled. We're not that bullish on that because of all the risk that we see with that, and maybe if we were targeting smaller businesses or even a B2C, I could see how there's a ton of interest in that, right? But being that we're going after the large enterprises, we can't afford any risk, and so we have to be very deterministic and understand those outputs. And so the way that we're automating contextual awareness is, first, we look at the content itself, and we're leveraging these large language models to cluster these topic areas. So the first part of that clustering of topic areas allows for the AI to understand, when a user is referring to topic A, how topic A is related to topic B and C and D and so on. And so it has this map of all these different clusters and how they interrelate. And then what it does is it automates the actual handling of that and understanding which topics are mutually exclusive of each other. So when I go in there and I ask a question of like, hey, I'm looking for, the horsepower on, the Mustang, the Ford Mustang, right? And I'm asking about the horsepower on that Mustang. What it's looking at is like, okay, there's a vehicle and there's a horsepower. Well, if my next question is like, well, hey, what about the Ford Explorer? It's now realizing that like the Mustang and Ford Explorer, that's a mutually, like, they can't both be like in that question. So now it's automatically replacing that Mustang with the Ford Explorer. And then if I said, okay, and what's the towing capacity on that? It realizes that, towing capacity and horsepower are mutually exclusive. Like, we can't answer both of those. And so it's understanding is how to handle that context because it understands all those different clustering. So we actually have two patents. One is for the initial clustering mechanism, and then the second is the handling of being able to know when to replace and maintain context.
Interesting. Does that require that initial clustering? Presumably that requires some form of pre-training, does it? You would get data from the client somehow, and you would build that. It sounds like a knowledge graph or some sort of ontology you would build based on being provided data first, or are you doing this in real time as conversations are happening and then you're building it as you go?
So the first thing we do is we ingest the content. The content from there is what we have is a zero-shot approach where it creates all these clusters, but you can fine tune it. And a lot of times what that means is adding different examples of where you would want the AI to respond with this specific content. Just because I like to say it gets you 70 to 80% of the way there. But like when you want to get it to the point where it's, accurate most of the time, like 90%, that's when you're going to want to be able to fine tune it. And that's where we have our GUI that we have a way where you can do that through, no code by adding different examples to different pieces of content and creating contextual tags for each of those different contents so that you can help train it. But again, out of the box, it's pretty good. Essentially when I look at what the previous generation of tech is, you'd be happy to get even close to this after working hours. I mean, you're talking like, multiple engineers, data scientists working on this for, 3-4, weeks at a time. And now we're getting there right away. And so it's funny, what I've seen is the expectation is now even higher in terms of what the accuracy should be, how conversational it should be. And that's fine, right? Like the expectations should continue to get higher. But it's only possible because of what these large language models are able to provide in terms of especially that speed that you can get to market with. Because like you're saying, when in real time, when we do handle these conversations, that's where we actually get the voice of the customer. And, we're in a lot of these exercises right now in the pilots that we're doing. One of the Fortune 100 automotive companies we're working with, we're handling their support inquiries, and we're seeing plenty of times where their content has not been developed in certain areas, and how quickly you can add that content and now have it part of the system. And that system now automatically updates into the clustering, into the handling of the context follow-ups. And so it's just much quicker than it ever was before. But there still is that process of, consistently building out new intents, new flows. It's just, the difference is how quick you can actually do that.
That's really good. And a lot of that stuff you're talking about there regarding data, obviously not a great deal of companies have fantastic data. So a lot of the work is in getting hold of the data in the first place, then making sure it's fit for consumption, making sure it's all sort of tagged properly and all that kind of stuff, making sure that it's, conversational, as you sort of suggested. I'm assuming from what you were saying earlier on, where you were talking about kind of turning content from being fairly poor into being fit for conversation, that process essentially, maybe you're leveraging large language models to do that, but I'm assuming there's a human in the loop at some point there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there has to be, right? Because what we're doing is leveraging the generative capabilities of large language models to shape that content and reword it, rephrase it, however you want to think about it. But it's changing the actual language. And with that, there's obviously the risk of, if someone doesn't review that, you're essentially doing what we're, not big fans of, which is leveraging generative to the end user without any type of constraints. So what we found is developing a really good relationship with the knowledge base team or whoever owns the content, because they have to be a very big part of this puzzle when you're thinking about, especially if you're going direct to customer support and customer engagement, wherever you're going to be directly facing with customers, you have to be changing and editing that content. And doing that, there's ways to expedite it, like we have with the generative capabilities of large language models. but then having that human in the loop to consistently review and make sure that those changes do stay consistent with what the brand message is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. And then the piece around, you were saying, where you get some examples of some agent conversations that are working well. You take those and then you create the basis of the conversation built off of that. How do you find, kind of like, in the kind of real world, when people are having conversations with it, do you find that the patterns are still the same? And what I mean by that is, like, because we've done things like in the past, tried taking transcripts, verbatim transcripts, got everything that a customer has said, build a model based off of that, and then you put a chatbot live or a voice bot live, and it turns out that actually how people speak to it are entirely different. Their responses are shorter. They are not necessarily shorter, but the tone is slightly different. If they know they're talking to a bot, that changes the interaction. So sometimes the traditional model, not a large language model, performs worse when you use real data. Different to if you're using the data that's coming through from them having a conversation with the bot, then that's fine. But if you just take transcripts, it often doesn't have the same sort of effect. So have you noticed that from the conversation pattern perspective, that building a conversation based on those agent transcripts has a positive impact in the wild?
Yeah, so you bring up a great point, and a lot of the time, when you actually see these transcripts, they're not what I would call ideal transcripts of how you even would want to handle some of the customer, conversation, especially when you're trying to automate it, right? There's just a different way that humans talk to each other versus how a human would interact with AI. And so, one, it's figuring out, hey, like, let's put the select few of transcripts and make sure we're very diligent on which ones we want to leverage first when going to the conversation, development or design. And like I said before, it's not a, hey, like you put the transcript in, pops out, and like, hey, let's put it right in front of customers. Like it gets you probably 70-80% of the way there. It does some of the mapping out of flows that you ultimately don't have to necessarily think of, but you still need that conversational designer or at least conversational content person that can look at that and be like, oh yeah, I wouldn't want it to respond like this in this situation. And so there's still a human in the loop need. And I see a lot of vendors in this space, making everything seem so easy and, it's just going to get there right away. And it's like, no, we have a way to do it. And I think you hear a lot of vendors, even us, say how easy it is because we know what it was before. And it really is that much easier than it's so much easier than it was before that it feels easy because you're like, oh, wow, we don't have to create all those different flows, figure out all the different contextual follow-ups. Now we can actually get 80% of the way there and then start to figure out where we want to, isolate some of the customer flows to maybe only go down a certain route because we don't want it to handle this because this is actually for human. And sometimes a great exercise, I've done this for the last few years, is whenever I talk to, any CX exec, especially on, that's focused on customer experiences, hey, like, write for me the ideal transcript of what you would want an agent and your user to say, and then do that with AI. And you start to see there are differences in how they would want the AI to respond versus the agent. And I think that's sometimes understanding these aren't the same, but there's definitely some transference in types of like being able to take that original transcript and make it very much like a baseline of what you use to design on top of.
Yeah, I remember a podcast I did years ago with Oren Jacob, who was the CEO of Pullstring, that then got acquired by Apple. And what he used to say is, because he worked as one of the sort of technical leads at Pixar, and a lot of the kind of Toy Story and Bugs Life and stuff like that, his team did the animations for it. And he told a really great story, which you've kind of touched on there, which is that his boss, he set a task basically, and he had to create a animated sequence of a lake or a bit of moving water, like an ocean or whatever, and comparing that to a real camera footage of a moving water. The task was, can you tell the difference between the two? And his boss eventually, after some studying, did pick out the right one and said, yeah, that's the animated one. But the lesson in there that Orange shared with us before was that what you're trying to do in that instance when you make an animated film is you're not trying to convince the user that it is real footage. You're just trying to take the principles of the way the water moves and the color of the water and the all of the bits that make it water, take all of that and instill it in the image so that when someone sees it, they know it's water. And the same thing is directly applicable to conversational AI, which is that you're not trying to replicate the conversation between a person and another person. You're trying to take the essence of the conversation and the hallmarks of the conversation and the nuances that make a conversation, and you're taking that to make the interface work better. Not necessarily to have the same conversation. It's all about making the interface work better. So it's interesting how you basically touched on that exact thing, you know.
I love that analogy. I really do. I might have to use that in a future customer call. But it's so true, right? I mean, like I would never interact with AI the way I interact with another person, regardless of if I'm close to that person or not. It's just we as humans have a certain comfortability of how we communicate to another person that we expect it to be, that person to be able to coherently respond and be able to carry on that conversation. Where I think there is going to be and you're starting to see this already with like the introduction of ChatGPT and people starting to get more comfortable with even sharing a lot more information when they're trying to get a response from AI. Sometimes what I do is I start every day looking through queries of our different customers for like their user queries, and you do start to see some of them where I'm like, wow, like that has to be influenced by ChatGPT in the sense of how they're asking a question, because that would have never been the way someone would have asked a question before. It was like, pouring out like the whole, like every single thing they're dealing with and then like asking for an end result. Whereas then some people are still in the mode of like just keywords, hey, like account. And it's like, well, now it's actually, there's two different, problems I see there, right? There's the one that shares a lot of information. It's figuring out how do we decompose that query and figure out what is the most important part of that query that we respond with. And then the other part is if someone just says account, well, now we need to figure out what more information we need. And it's figuring out the balance of how we leverage these large language models to assist in being able to disambiguate when someone says account. Oh, what would you like to know about account? Here are some of the options. Or leverage the large language model to decompose and get rid of the noise in a query to be, oh, what's the core focus of what they're trying to figure out? And so, I think we're in an interesting time now more than ever, because I think you're going to start seeing these two types of extremes be start to become more common. Whereas before it was, hey, like a lot of people are still on the side of, I just want to, give a couple words because that's all they think that the AI can handle. And so now I think we're in a balancing act of being able to appease to both groups.
That's really interesting. I can imagine that actually once someone gets used to using ChatGPT, now with the chatbot on an insurance website, and it's like, right, here's my situation, lay it out step by step, be super clear, detailed, like a prompt. What do you want to do about that? Tell me what's the next step. And it's like 99.9% of chatbots right now, but like, I'm sorry, didn't get that. I'm not ChatGPT. That's mad. Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Yeah, we're almost up on time now, but we'll definitely stick the Conversational AI Divide podcast link in the show notes. Let's stick the Knowbl website in there as well for those that want to reach out. Maybe your LinkedIn in there also. Any final thoughts? Any closing words? What would you like people to take away from this?
I think the big thing is just if you're an enterprise or even, just a fan of this space, to really start to challenge people on why can't direct customer support still be the end goal? Why do we have to pivot away to, the agent facing, employee facing use cases? And not because those don't bring value, they do, but we can't just disregard the customer support mechanism that we ultimately want because we think that generative AI can't, has risk to it, which it does have risk to it, depending on how you leverage it. If you leverage it strictly to just face the end user without any type of constraint, even guardrails are not going to be the solution. And so guardrails don't equal guarantees. And, what right now we're in the midst of pilots where we're facing plenty of thousands of users right now across these Fortune 500 brands. And after these pilots, I'm sure we'll have some great numbers that we'll be able to talk about even further, and hopefully see a lot of these go into a production setting where we're hitting millions of users. So early on still in our journey, only 2 years, and we're getting a lot of traction. But as always, Kane, like, I love these conversations. I feel like this space, I didn't choose this space, it chose me. And I know that's a cliche, but it really, just like your journey and how you ended up in this space, I don't think any of us grew up saying, yeah, conversational AI is where I'm going to end up. But it's always funny how we do get here.
It is, yeah. It wasn't even a thing, really. But I suppose it kind of was when I was born. There was, things you could talk to, and the technology was sort of developing and stuff. But it certainly wasn't something that would be even remotely seen as a career. It's mad how things have, even in the last 5 years, it's when it's all, for me at least, become sort of apparent. And it's great that we can, spend time doing stuff that we love, meeting fantastic people, sharing knowledge, and it's ideal. So I really appreciate you spending some time with me, and thanks very much.
Yeah, no doubt. Have a great holiday season.
And yourself, yeah. Happy Thanksgiving for this Thursday, and happy Christmas if I don't see you. Isn't it mad how I was in Happy Christmas at already? This year's just flew by, but
it always does.
It's crazy. Anyway, nice one. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate that. Don't forget to check out the AI World Series. Don't forget, if you are around London next week, Thursday or Wednesday 29th, Thursday 30th, check out the Call and Contact Center Expo. It's totally free to attend as well, by the way. Should have mentioned that at the beginning. And then do check out the Conversational AI Divide podcast with Matt Taylor. And if you have a look at that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you may also find another conversation with me on there. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you'll probably enjoy